Jewish Museum of Florida, now the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. So we're very happy to have Dr. Green here with us this evening. He is also the founder of Sephardi Voices, and an audio-visual digital archive, which is an audio-visual digital archive of Arab Jews. He has served as a visiting fellow at Oxford University and at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and has given testimony to the Congressional Human Rights Caucus in the United States and as an advocate for the rights of those displaced. So we're very, very, very pleased to have both of these distinguished speakers. Throughout tonight's program, you, our audience, are encouraged to post questions to the chat. We will have an opportunity to discuss these in the later half of the program, where the education manager of the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, Luna Goldberg, will facilitate. So without further ado, please welcome our guests, Rabbi Funnye and Dr. Henry Green.
Okay, so let me first just say how much I appreciate the opportunity to be with Rabbi Funnye this evening. Tuda Parfit, who was supposed to be here, unfortunately had a minor accident and is not able to join us. But I want to thank Susan and FIU and the community for inviting me to be part of this evening. So I want to begin by just asking Rabbi Funnye to understand your sort of journey, your spiritual journey. So can you tell us about your background, a bit about your family and your religious evolution to Judaism?
Well, thank you very much, Professor Green. I deeply appreciate being here, and I want to extend a heartfelt todah rabbah to the Jewish Museum of Miami, Florida, and to my very dear friend, Professor Tuda Parfit, for the invitation to be with you this evening. My background is what led me to Judaism. I was invited when I was attending high school in South Carolina. The pastor of my church said, "Hey, I think you would make a good pastor. And why don't you think about going to school?" And I said, you know, I never really had thought about it. But as I began to think about it, I had some very serious questions. And those questions then led me on my spiritual journey that eventually brought me to Judaism. One question was about the certain elements of the Christian faith. For me, that the answers that I was receiving just weren't satisfactory, and I thought that there should be more with respect to what we were getting and what we were receiving. And when I went to Howard University, I just started cracking books and studying and investigating, and eventually I found my way to Judaism. I had studied Judaism for many years before I went through conversion. And I can only tell you that I continue to learn on a daily basis, because Judaism, the one thing that I have always enjoyed about being a Jew is that my questioning, you have to question to be a good Jew. And to being and sometimes you don't find the answer, but sometimes you spark something by the mere fact that you are questioning. And so questioning, Judaism allowed me to synthesize my intellectualism with my spirituality, and they were both comfortable within me. And so I questioned everything and all things related to Judaism. Not only am I a graduate of the Israelite Academy in New York, but I also am a graduate of Spertus Institute of Judaica in Chicago. I hold 2 degrees from that institution, an undergraduate degree in Jewish studies, as well as a master's degree in human services administration. So my journey, moving on my journey, my mother was kind of distraught at the beginning because she said, "Oh my God, how can you be leaving the church?" And when she began to study with me, and I would go to her house and show her why I was doing this, and she came to realize that I wasn't leaving God, but in fact, getting closer to God. And so she saw that Judaism, and I'm very delighted to say that before she passed in 2000, that she would have her pastor invite me, particularly during Black History Month, to attend their services and to give a sermon, a darash, to the congregants there. So she, in fact, was very proud. And so much so, not only did I convert to Judaism, but I have a sister that also converted to Judaism. And I have another sister that was on the way. And then my mother pulled the Jewish mother piece on my sister and said, "Oh my God, is everybody going to be a Jew and going to leave me all alone in the church?" And so so she whipped that gift card on my youngest sister. And she said, "Oh no, Mom, I'm going to stay with you in church. It doesn't matter where I worship." But she too was extremely interested in the Jewish faith.
So okay, so here you are, you decide to become Jewish, but as you know,
Yes.
There's a continuum in terms of Jewish, which you can be Reform or you can be ultra-Orthodox. And so you made a decision to be converted conservative. I understand. So can you tell us about that a bit? You know, because it's a big continuum in terms of American Jewry.
It is. So I visited Orthodox congregations, particularly modern Orthodox congregations. I visited Reform congregations, but I felt most comfortable in the conservative setting. It examined the halakha, the Talmud, from a perspective of modernity and looking at things in modernity, and actually understanding that, were we closest to God at Sinai, or are we getting closer to God as we move throughout the ages? And I think from the perspective that I learned through several of my professors, that we're moving closer to a greater understanding as we move through the ages. And so to me, the conservative movement offered the best choice for myself and my family. All of my children attended Jewish day school at a synthesized school, Akiba Schechter. So Akiba was the name of many Orthodox schools, and then Schechter was a conservative. And so my kids went to Akiba Schechter, the synthesis of the merger of a Schechter school and an Akiba Orthodox school. So they all attended Jewish day school. And the rabbi of the congregation, the rabbi with they attended school, was actually one of my professors. And it just really worked out well for me. So the conservative, now, but back then, interesting enough, I like to tell people, well, I'm conservative, but actually conservadox, because I was invited to say, listen, you know a lot of professors and rabbis. Who do you want to serve in your bet din? And so I asked the vice president of our institution, Byron Sherwin, and I asked another former dean of our school, Dr. Nathaniel Stamper. Now, what I didn't know, that I knew that Byron Sherwin was a conservative rabbi, but I didn't know that Professor Stamper was modern Orthodox. And he agreed to be on the bet din. And then the Moel for Hatafat Dam Brit was also an Orthodox person, Orthodox Jew. So for me, I like to say conservadox was a synthesis. In all my life, I've synthesized things. I've blended. I blend. I'm Jewish, but I'm also a person of African descent, and so I don't separate that. But it's married simultaneously within the recesses of my being.
So then let me turn to the topic, Black lives in a Jewish context. So what do you think the role is of the Jewish community to the Black Lives Matters community today? What do you think that connection is?
I think I'm involved with several communities outside of Chicago. One that originates in Newark, New Jersey, where a congregation in Newark, a conservative congregation in Newark, wanted to reach out to the African-American community in Newark, and I had spoken there several years ago, and they invited me to be a part of this meeting. So I feel that the Jewish community is very interested in Black Lives Matters, just as they were interested and gave a great deal of assistance during the 1960s. I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Clarence Jones, who was one of Dr. King's speechwriters and a very close confidant of Dr. King's. And we were in Washington, D.C. And as we looked out over where the I Have a Dream speech took place, Dr. Jones said, "Rabbi, the majority of the people that were here on that day in August were actually from the Jewish community." And as a matter of fact, Rabbi Prince opened up with prayer. And we all know about the relationship that Dr. King had with Rabbi Heschel. But beyond that, there was a strong connection when Dr. King moved to Chicago. And a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Marks, who started an organization called the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, and that wanted to work against racism and anti-Semitism, because he saw within the context of fighting against racism was also fighting against anti-Semitism. And I strongly believe that to this day. And so I never will forget the saying that I saw once a Holocaust film, and it said something like, "When they came for the Catholics, I wasn't Catholic. And when they came for the Protestant, I wasn't a Protestant. And when they came for me, I didn't say anything either one of those times. And when they came for me, there was no one left to say anything for me." And so I think from a Jewish perspective, it is important that we support Black Lives Matters, because it says to the African-American community that there is concern, that human dignity is very important, that we Jews see you as being made in the image of God, just as all human beings are made in the image of God. And I think that that's very important to the Jewish community and to the Jewish world. And when we talk about tikkun olam, repairing the world and making things right, it's an active thing. I believe that God is a verb. And so that we as Jews put into action our faith. And we have faith in stating that all people are equal. So that is demonstrated by our faith. We do that by supporting these particular organizations, Black and Latinx organizations as well. I think it's very, very important.
So Tudor's not here, but he wrote a book recently that was published called Hybrid Hate. And he talks about the deep connections between anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism. And I want to just refer to, I made a note here, which I find, about two events that happened in the last few years. The first had to do with the in Charleston in 2017 when 9 Black people were killed during Bible study at the Methodist Episcopal Church. And then a year later, 11 people were killed in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life.
Yes.
And you have both of these events taking place within the last few years.
Yes.
And I wondered, as a rabbi, as a person who is trying to empower not just the Jewish community, but the Black community, America, how do you help us in keeping our hearts focused on social justice when such events happen?
First of all, we have to reach out when something happens, like the tragedy that happened in Charleston, South Carolina, at the Emmanuel Church there. I think the Jewish community responded with an outpouring of support. And just as the massacre at the Tree of Life synagogue, oh my God, that was a Shabbat day, a Shabbat morning. And I'll never forget it, because we had many guests from out of town that year, and it was, I mean, people began to cry as we were moving through services when we got that news. And we also cried when I heard about what happened at Emmanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. But one of the differences that when we talk about Black Lives Matters, Dylan Roof, who was the individual that went into the church in Charleston, South Carolina, and killed 9 people. He murdered 9 people who had welcomed them, who had wanted to embrace him. When he left the church, the treatment that he received from the police was treatment that everybody should be receiving. First of all, he was captured. He was handcuffed. He didn't get thrown on the ground. He didn't have a knee placed on his neck. He had just murdered 9 people, just murdered. And they asked, well, are you hungry? And they took him to Burger King. And now you take that with what happened in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life and what happened in more recently with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all these other situations. It does not seem that Black Lives Matters. We have, in the world population, 5% of the world population in the United States. But we have the highest prison population of any industrialized country in the world. And that prison population is over 40%. And so some of the things that have to be adjusted and looked at and studied, one of the films that I reviewed, a documentary called The 13th Amendment, and how the 13th Amendment was then shifted because it says, well, we can't have slaves anymore. However, if someone is arrested and incarcerated, then they lose their rights. And so then they become a part of the prison industrial complex. And so now it's akin to slavery. It is akin to modern day slavery, being incarcerated. And what grew out of that? Well, we had people who had crack cocaine got 40 years. People who were using powder cocaine got a couple of years or a slap on the wrist. Well, most of the people that were using crack cocaine were Black and brown people. But yet the disparity in the sentencing was phenomenal. It was astronomical. And we have spent, I know in the state of Illinois, we built in this state within 12 years, this is going back to the 70s and early 80s, we built almost a prison a year for like 13 years. And at the same time, we were closing our mental health facilities in the state of Illinois and really shifting it. And there were, yes, we protested about the closing of these mental health facilities. Where did these people go? They needed help. they're on the street. And so eventually they're trying to feed themselves. So they're going to be involved in crime and criminal activity. So we have to, as a society, I think, take a better job at providing the type of resources that will assist people and help people get out of their particular situations. But the Jewish community should be very attentive to Black Lives Matter, and the African-American community must be very attentive to Jewish lives, to the rise of anti-Semitism, because it is increasing in this country daily. The reports that you get from ADL and the Southern Law Poverty Center studies these things of racism, and it is growing precipitously in our country. And the divisiveness on the political basis is really, in my opinion, frightening.
No, I totally agree with you. The polarization, and if you take a look at statistics, this is the statistics indicate that anti-Semitism is as high as well, not as high, but it's second in terms of what was going on in the 30s. And
Right.
Living in Miami, if one listens to Spanish radio, one hears at times virulent anti-Semitism. So let's look a bit ahead then. So what's happening now is we have this legislation going on in Florida. We have this legislation going on in Georgia. And I wondered, what's your take on this? Is it going to not only decrease the opportunity for people to vote, but is it going to create, is it going to make it harder for Jews and Blacks to work together in terms of legislative interests?
I think they're trying to make it harder. First of all, the demographics of America are changing, and it's been reported that perhaps by 2030, it'll be basically brown and Black will be the majority of the population, certainly by 2050. And it's about retention of power. And unfortunately, it attempts to break the very essence of what America is based upon, and that is the Constitution. And so if we say that the Constitution is only applicable for white folks, and Black folks should be, as going back to Jim Crow, when you were asked as a Black voter how many bubbles in a bar of soap, how many jelly beans in a jar, and things of that nature, as tests to test your intelligence. It was very discriminatory. So we have to be on guard. We have to be vigilant. And I think legislatures in Georgia, in Florida, and in the other 29 states that their legislatures have made moves to, in fact, suppress the votes of Black and brown people. I think that we need to really speak up as Jews, particularly, because if any student of Jewish history understands suppression, and they understand, when you understand suppression and anti-Semitism, my mind runs back to Nazi Germany. My mind runs back to Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when synagogues were burned and businesses were burnt. And people say, oh, that could never happen here. Well, January the 6th really said to me, we have to be careful, because perhaps it can happen here. Perhaps the Constitution is not the strongest thing. It's not written with an iron pen. It's not something that is firm and locked, but it's something that you can pick and choose what you want out of it, and particularly when one is in power. And so it was a dangerous situation, a very dangerous situation. And it said to me that we need to be vigilant in speaking up, all of us, for our democracy. It is critical that we speak forcefully with united voices from across the racial spectrum, from across the religious spectrum. I mean, look at what is happening within the Asian community today. And it's well, we need to be with the Asian community as well. We need to be supportive of any community that is being oppressed or that is being the victim of racial discrimination or racial hatred. We need to be out there crying and saying and speaking up to those individuals in power and saying all people need to be protected.
So I wanted to bring us back to Jewish in a much more specific way. So one could say that in the Jewish community, you have Sephardi, Ashkenazi. Those are the two main trajectories. You have Ethiopian, whatever, but those are the two main. And the Sephardi were a displaced community, 1 million Jews in 1948, living in North Africa, the Middle East. And today there's 20,000 left. Some are in Israel, the majority, but there is a big community in the United States, huge community in France. And so I was wondering, as a rabbi, in terms of your community, when you look at the Sephardi, then I say to myself, well, how does the Black community look at the Sephardi? Because what happens is that there's a kind of Ashkenazic centricity.
Mm-hmm.
And yet here you have Arab Jews
mm-hmm.
who have been discriminated against also, and who are leaving France, and who went through discrimination in Israel. And I was wondering, how do you view that?
Well, I view it with in some instances, I'll give you a story. I was invited to be the speaker for Martin Luther King Day in Paris, France. And I didn't even know that they celebrated Martin Luther King Day. But I went there and I was invited by the Jewish community to speak. And yes, it was a Sephardic community. Yes, I was welcomed in there. And it was a wonderful experience at the time. I went several years ago. But since that time, I've been in touch with friends that are still in Paris, Jews that are still in Paris. And when I read in Haaretz that some Jews in Paris that are observant Jews, but they don't even wear their kippah, their kippot in public now. They take their kippot out. That's the type of thing that I'm talking about. I went to during the Parliament of World Religions. It was held in Barcelona, Spain, and I went to Barcelona, and a good dear friend of mine, Professor Ephraim Isaac, he's Ethiopian and Yemeni. We went to a synagogue. Now there were armed guards outside of the synagogue with submachine guns, but when we got through the doors of the synagogue, the Saxton came up and said, "Oh, Shabbat Shalom, are you a Kohen, a Levi, or Israel?" And I said, wow, what a way to be greeted in a synagogue. Not are you Jewish, not what are you doing here? It got to be Jewish. I'm coming by this guard that you got two of them outside, and so wanting to be a part and wanting to worship with you. We need to. The Sephardi community, the Yemeni community, the Yemenite community, when they first went to Israel during Magic Carpet back in 1949, they faced an inordinate amount of discrimination from the Ashkenazim. As a matter of fact, I mean, even the various movement, the rabbis of various movements who are not a part of the rabbinute who are not a part of some Orthodox, one extreme or the other, are not even recognized and honored. And as Jews, this is counterproductive. This is counterproductive, because if we are separating ourselves, then we are hurting ourselves. And so I look at that as being totally counterproductive to moving along and building stronger relationships with diverse communities as a Jew. So I'm a Jew of African descent. I remember when I was named a Chief Rabbi of our community, I was invited to a very dear friend of mine, Orthodox Rabbi Lubavitcher. He's deceased now. And he said, well, now that you're the Chief Rabbi, why don't you guys become Orthodox? And that way everybody will, will respect you. I said, well, I'm hoping that everybody respects me now, Rabbi, and I don't, I don't believe that I should have to dress like you and wear this hat and things that you do to be pleasing in the eyes of Hashem. And for me, my goal is to please Hashem. And I learned that one of the ways that I can please Hashem is by being proactive in assisting and helping. And that is what is being Jewish to me, doing Jewish, assisting, helping. And that's how I do my best Judaism, when I assist, when I help. And my example are rabbis from every stream, conservative, reform, reconstructionist, modern Orthodox rabbis across the spectrum who care about people who really care about Israel. And Israel is an interesting place because it's such a rich place. And for it to be such a young country, and it has such a great potentiality. And I want people to understand that. I want people to see that. I want people to feel Israel when they get off the plane. And so that I want there to be a welcoming of the state of Israel for all people. Looking at the Christian tourists that come to Israel of all streams, I mean, they're flooding in Israel. But yet, when it comes to Israelis, and then, there's a question about what stream you belong to. And we have to really get beyond that. We have to really get beyond stream. So in our synagogue, we use a Sephardic siddur, a prayer book. Our synagogue, we don't have a physical mekitza, but we sit separately, men and women. Now, I'm an egalitarian. So women are welcomed in our congregation to be full participants in every aspect of our worship service, from receiving aliyot to reading Sefer Torah, all of it. As a matter of fact, the president of our congregation and the vice president are two women. And so we have always had women for the last 35 years that have served as officers in our congregation. So I believe strongly that in the prophet it says, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. And so when you come into our synagogue, if you put your tallis on right side up, and if you know how to hold the siddur, we're assuming that you're Jewish. And we're not going to ask, are you Jewish? And so, because you know how to hold a prayer book, and you got the talit on right side up. Sometimes I've traveled to different places and gone to daven on a Monday morning, and after service, oh my God, you were praying in Jewish, and are you Jewish? Well, you don't advertise. And I found you. And it's 7:30 in the morning. Why else am I here if I'm not Jewish? and you didn't have air conditioning. So let's get out of this dominant understanding of what a Jew looks like, and who Jews tend to look like the people relative to the countries in the world that you find Jews in. So in China, the Jewish community of Kaifeng, when they were in existence, they looked Chinese. In Ethiopia, the Jews look like other Ethiopians. And so in Poland, they look like other Polish people. They tend to look like the people in the countries that they're found in. And so let us not be surprised or overwhelmed when we see Jews of color, when we see Jews of African descent. There's a growing community. I work with a group called Kulanu, all of us. Kulanu works with emerging communities across the world, but we are stressing some work in Africa. We're working with the Limba people in South Africa and Zimbabwe. We're working with the Igbo people in Nigeria and a part of Ghana. And we're working with all types of people who identify with Judaism and who are on that path, that spiritual path. And as I well understand, it is a spiritual journey. And so becoming a part of the Jewish people was extremely important to me. And I want to feel welcomed, and I want to be welcoming to all that approach our community. Kol Yisrael HaRabim. We are all responsible for each other.
This concept of tzedakah, which most people think in terms of giving money, is really to elevate ourselves, to be more in the image of God,
yes,
to serve. And what you're expressing is this continuous journey you are on in terms of trying to elevate us so that we can be more in the image of God and act in ways that can fulfill it. And one of those ways is also social justice,
exactly,
among other things. So let me ask you, we have maybe 5 more minutes before we go to questions. So I want to understand then, what is the relationship between the Black community, Jewish community in the United States, and the Black Jewish community in Israel? What's going on in terms of the kesher, the connection?
Well, for me, the connection, I'm working on building a strong connection. I was first I went to Ethiopia in 2018, and then from Ethiopia, we went to Israel. My delegation went to Israel. Our main purpose for going to Israel at that particular time was to connect with the Beit Yisrael, the Israeli community the Ethiopian community in Israel. And so we, in fact, were hosted by a Beit Yisrael family, and I attended services at the Ethiopian synagogue, and then I went to a Sephardic synagogue. So we are working to establish ties, strong ties, with the Beit Yisrael in the state of Israel. We are very supportive of them, and when I became Chief Rabbi, several of the Kassim leadership wrote a very strong endorsement as I was being raised to this particular office. And so I look to work with, in Uganda, we work with Rabbi Gershom Somuzu and his community, the Abu Yudea. There are growing communities in Kenya and other, as I mentioned before, other parts of Africa, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Cameroon, Nigeria, Ghana. And so we are working, and I've been to all these countries, and is in traveling there to build relationships. It's about building relationships, building bridges.
One of the things that Rabbi Kronish, who was a rabbi in Miami, post 1967, what he tried to do was to bring Israelis as sort of scholars in residence to synagogues in order to provide an understanding of what's really happening. But it wasn't, when I say scholars, they were members from kibbutzim, they were members from different walks of life. It was the real Israel, in other words. But he viewed them as scholars because they were living Israel.
Yes.
And I was wondering, do you bring people from the Black community, the Ethiopian community from Israel to your synagogue as a way of having a kind of gesher, as you say, a bridge between the two?
Yes. Well, yes. As a matter of fact, we've here in the Midwest, the Consul General's Office for the Midwest has a young Ethiopian woman that works in the consulate office. We have had her at our synagogue. We've had the official Israeli government official of the Consul General at our synagogue. So we believe in building strong ties. We've had the Ethiopian, she was the ambassador, first Ethiopian ambassador from the state of Israel, from Ethiopia. She returned and she worked there for 5 years as ambassador to the ambassador of Israel to Ethiopia. And so she came and spoke at our congregation. We invite Ethiopians. We don't have the population of Ethiopians in this country, in this city that we have, like in Washington, D.C., where it's just, in Washington, D.C. But, and particularly, we have Ethiopians here, but many are, Christians. So we don't necessarily have a large Ethiopian community. Now, we are named Ethiopian Hebrews because one of our founders of our community immigrated to Ethiopia and settled in Ethiopia. His name was Arnold Josiah Ford, and he immigrated to Ethiopia in 1929, 1930, and with a large contingent of individuals. Unfortunately, he passed away in 1935, right before the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. So Ethiopia represented not just for us a place on the map. Ethiopia, if you look at your map and you look at all of the countries in the continent of Africa that were colonized, you have two that weren't: Liberia and Ethiopia. Well, Liberia was founded by former slaves, but Ethiopia has a very rich history. So to us, the expression Ethiopia on our name means an unconquered spirit, an unconquered spirit, and that's what it implies for us in our minds and in our understanding.
Thank you. So Luna, let me turn it over to you then, or Nancy. I don't know who's doing the chat for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Green. Thank you, Rabbi Funnye. We have an active chat, and so I'll also ask the audience, if you have any questions, please also keep dropping them into the chat. So let's start with this one from Diane King. And Diane asks, how do you speak to white Jews who are racist and feel threatened by Black people in general?
Well, I try to speak to them, first of all, with an understanding, and I try to make them comfortable. Most of the places that I travel to, it's to white synagogues across the country. And what I try to show and teach is that it's okay to be open. It's okay to be accepting of Jews of color. It's okay to try to understand. What we have to do, when people say to me, well, they need to be afraid of Black people, that's, please, That's just really not the case. In most neighborhoods, even in the city of Chicago, I would have a greater chance of having something bad happen to me than a person white walking down the same street. Why? Because as a Black man, they don't feel as threatened, or maybe they won't be pursued as diligently as if I was a white person. Just period. And that's a fact. That's why I gave the example of Dylan Roof, who killed 9 people at the church in Charleston, South Carolina. He wasn't thrown on the ground. When I saw him, he was standing up. He had a protective vest on, and he was being taken for lunch because he was hungry. But Michael Gardner, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, here in Chicago, So we have, those are issues. Those are issues that have to be addressed.
Yeah, and I guess a follow-up question that I have for you is around relationships to the police, because, we're living in a moment where we clearly need change, but there's also this relationship in many of our synagogues. Many of us have security and guards, and many of them are ex-police force members. So how do we navigate this relationship?
Well, I'll tell you this, in many instances in Chicago, many of the security for synagogues are on duty, but they're off duty, but they are members of the Chicago Police Department or a police department in one of the suburbs of the city. And they have to be, I think, trained. The police need a higher level of training. When people say defund the police, are you kidding? What are you talking about? How are you going to defund the police? Defund the police. Now, if you're saying that the resources of the police need to be redirected and reallocated for greater training relative to sensitivity, relative to having a understanding of how does the people in the African American community think, and so it's about understanding, it's about learning, it's about education, and there's just too little of that in most of our major cities today.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have another question from Travis Dozier, who asks about your perspective on African Americans receiving reparations.
Yeah, it's very good. I did a piece in one of the I think Moment magazine, and where this question was asked of several rabbis from different streams, and my answer was, of course. I believe that African Americans deserve reparations. It's if for all of the suffering through the Middle Passage, through slavery, through Jim Crow, through the whole section of not being able to sit in the lunch counter, not even being able to go in a particular bathroom, those were all totally demeaning activities. And most of the wealth of major corporations was built up off of slave labor. I mean, let's be frank about it. So, and then there are billions and trillions of dollars, and now you're saying, oh, I'm sorry? Well, in Judaism, I'm sorry isn't enough. In Judaism, if you're sorry, now you have to make it right. You have to now add a particular portion to making it right. And just saying you're sorry doesn't make it right. So if I borrow your car and have an accident and bring it back and say, I'm sorry about your car. And you say, well, are you going to pay for it? That's Judaism. That's my understanding. So just when people say that they're sorry, this doesn't mean anything. You have to show that you're sorry. What are you offering? What are you giving up?
Thank you. Our next question is from Joel Minsker, and he asks, how do we reconcile those in BLM, the Black Lives Matter, that depart from the original intent and preach changing America by first deconstructing the present economic and political structure? So, for example, they are now far from the original goal of Martin Luther King's tolerance and judging a person by his character rather than the color of his or her skin.
So we have a lot of places we can go with that. First of all, it's not about, I think that we have what we have on paper relative to the Constitution of the United States and the Declaration of Independence. These are critical documents. Now we have to get them where they apply to everyone. And if in fact they apply to everyone equally, equal justice, not just your justice or my justice, but equal justice is what we must be seeking. And that includes our brothers and sisters of Asian descent who are we're having a rise in hate crimes against them. It makes no sense. It makes absolutely unequivocally no sense. So we have to do just to take what we have and apply what we have already on paper and apply that to our lives and treat each individual with respect, with understanding. And if we can get there, we'll go a long way. And we have to have the political will. It has to be the political will of those in leadership who are leading us. If they are not going to address things when they see things that are not right, then we're not. I've traveled throughout Africa and other countries around the world as well. But I'll tell you, sometimes things can get so where crime or corruption becomes systemic, and it permeates through every level of a culture from the political process, and it started in the political process, and it continued to spiral down. It continued to spiral down. So, and I don't want the United States of America to get in that position, not at all. What I've seen in some places on the continent of Africa.
Our next question is from Harvey Burstein, and he asks, is it true that the oldest congregation in Chicago is a Black Jewish congregation?
Not in Chicago, no. We have, our congregation was founded in 1918.
Oh, wow.
Our congregation was founded, but there were several congregations in the Chicago area that date back to the 1850s. And I think the oldest congregation in Chicago may date back to like the 1830s. I think it's the 1830s.
That's fascinating because, here in Miami, it's such a young city. Our congregation, our building dates back to 1929, and the congregation existed shortly before then, but it's such a shorter history than in other parts of the country.
Yeah.
My
Well,
closing. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to mention that I've also had the blessing and the honor to travel to the Toro Synagogue, which is the oldest Sephardic synagogue in Rhode Island. And I mean, wow, what ruach. And I was there with a group of rabbis at a halal, and it was special. It was really special. And they still have the seat where George Washington visited draped with a curtain. I mean, it's really fantastic. It was a really ominous opportunity just to see the synagogue, and it's still there. I mean, it's fantastic.
Incredible. I have a closing question for you, and then I will hand it back to our executive director. So my last question is, can you point us to resources or organizations that are doing work around intersectionality and allyship?
Oh, absolutely. I mentioned the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs in Chicago, JCUA. And now even Spertus College of Judaica is trying to do some intersectionality work as well. But you have Teruah, headed by Rabbi Jill Jacobs in New York. You have, there are numerous. If you just type in social justice or Jewish social justice agencies, and you will get them. I mean, in social justice, you're getting so many more federations who are developing, putting arms of the federation, dealing with social justice and dealing with these other particular issues. So the organizations are all over. Bacola Shone in San Francisco, in Every Voice. Kulanu, which is a New York-based organization. Oh my goodness. If I sat here long enough, but I know the time is up, I could think of more.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Rabbi. I'm going to call up our executive director, Susan Gladstone Pasternak, to close the program.
Thank you so much, Luna. And thank you so much to our distinguished guests this evening, Rabbi Funnye and Dr. Henry Green, for this really fascinating conversation, which I feel we could probably continue for longer, and I'm sorry we're out of time. And to our co-sponsors, the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, and the Global Jewish Studies program at the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at FIU. I'd like to invite all of you to join us for the final lecture of the series, Black Lives in a Jewish Context, next week. Interestingly enough, Rabbi Funnye, our speaker, Becco Lichtman, is going to be joining us for a lecture titled Inclusion, a Vital Jewish Value. And Becco Lichtman, a former resident here of Miami, identifies as Black, gay, and Jewish, and currently lives in Paris with his husband, which you mentioned earlier in your speech. So that will be next week. Luna, perhaps you can put that into our chat so that people know how to join us. It's been a fascinating conversation. Again, Rabbi, Dr. Green, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thank you so very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Susan.
Bye-bye now.
Good night.
Good night.